It's a polydynaclog in eisiau hylson eisiau do ciani bys ystin bit yn ei dysgu do eisiau dysgnyle cyn hojon y dent nasha. Hi, my name is Polly Denekla. I am Meadow People born for Towering House People. I am a citizen of the Navajo Nation and I'm originally from Gallup, New Mexico, but I'm currently based in Washington, D.C., where I am a political correspondent for ICT, formerly known as Indian Country Today.
So to start off with the platforms and the candidates, when it comes to Kamala Harris's tenure as vice president under the Biden administration, when it comes to Indigenous rights, are there specific policies or actions that she's taken that has stood out to you? Or how would you overall assess her relationship to the Native American community and the issues that impact that community mostly?
If we're looking very specifically at Vice President Harris's record as part of the Biden administration, there is no question that the Biden administration has been there's a very positive relationship between tribal nations and the Biden administration. The Biden administration has poured unprecedented amounts of funding into tribal nations, the most money that any administration has ever funneled into tribal nations. And so that's through the bipartisan infrastructure bill. That's also through the various other acts that the Biden administration has signed into law. They also appointed the first ever Native American person to oversee the Department of the Interior. That has been seen as a huge win for tribal leaders as well as for Native voters. And and so those are kind of the records that you see when it comes to the Biden administration. And part of that too is the Biden administration has appointed more Native people across various departments than any other administration. There is no question about that. Native people are involved at everything from commerce all the way to HHS. And so you see how much Kamala Harris and President Joe Biden have made it a point to have a good relationship with Native American communities as well as tribal leaders. But the reason why all of this is such an emphasis within the Biden administration is because the Native vote is the reason that Biden is in the White House. And so Arizona went blue because of the Native vote.
Have there been any kind of maybe failures or, kind of a lack thereof in addressing issues that impact the tribal nations that you've seen from the Biden administration?
There will always be issues within an administration. And one of the big things, and I think that we saw worldwide attention to this, is the controversial Willow Project up in the North Slope in Alaska. And so there were many folks, and Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, before she was secretary, she was against the Willow Project when she was in the House. And then as secretary, her department issued permits to the oil and gas companies for the Willow Project to continue for another 30 years, which was a very controversial move. There were a lot of Inupiaq people up in Alaska who did not approve of the Willow Project, who did not support the Willow Project, who continue to not support the Willow Project. But on the other side of that, there were a lot of Inupiaq people who were in support of it, including a lot of their elected officials and folks who represented the corporations, the Alaska Native corporations in Alaska. And so that was a controversial decision that the Biden administration did, going against his policy and his platform of moving towards green energy and doing carbon reduction by 2030. And so that was a huge decision. And one of the other issues that's really important to Indigenous people is the boarding schools. And so there have been two boarding school reports, one last year, one this year, that were recent. The most recent boarding school report was released just a few weeks ago. And so that is another huge issue. And I think that a lot of Native folks wanted to see a little bit more from the Biden administration when it came to what the move towards is really a United States version of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission created here in the United States to really look into what happened at federal Indian boarding schools. That's a huge issue that Native folks are concerned about. And then the other is missing and murdered Indigenous people. And the Biden administration and Interior Secretary Holland have created the missing and murdered unit under the Interior, but there are a lot of questions about what they actually do and the resources that they provide and what they have actually done in terms of addressing the issue, like on the grounds.
Transitioning, if you feel comfortable and have, kind of the understanding of the Trump administration, would you be willing to speak to some of his records, excuse me, regarding tribal nations and the rights of Indigenous people under his administration in 2016 to 2020?
There are 3 Indigenous members of Congress from Oklahoma, as well as the governor of Oklahoma, who are all Indigenous, who support former President Donald Trump. And there are 5 Indigenous members of Congress, and 3 of them have already endorsed former President Donald Trump. And I have talked to I'm frequently in conversations with one of the past Trump advisors who was part of the transition team getting Native people appointed into the Trump administration. He's one of our regular contributors at ICT. His name's Michael Stopp. He has told me that the Trump administration has been good to Indigenous people. They are friendly, I should say, to Indigenous nations. The Trump administration did have a tribal advisor in the White House. So that's one thing that President Trump did have. Some of the more conservative values of Indigenous voters, Trump championed. So things that are important to conservative Indigenous voters are the issues that he addressed or said he was going to address during his administration. And on the other side, he shrunk monuments that were really important to Native people. And that was one of the things that he did through executive order. So that's Bears Ears, which was a huge controversy. It was that and Chaco Canyon here in New Mexico. And so those were some really significant decisions that the Trump administration made. And also the oil and gas leases were another issue. And so his administration signed a lot of oil and gas leases, and a lot of those are on tribal lands. And so that is just some of the issues that happened under the Trump administration. Another big thing is that the Trump administration chose not to continue the Tribal Nations Summit. And so after he was elected, there was no Tribal Nations Summit for 4 years. And so President Joe Biden brought that back under his administration. And there is also the Tribal Youth Gathering that is also hosted by the White House that was started under the Obama administration as well. And that was not held either under the Trump administration. And so those are just some of the few things that happened under the Trump administration. But I do want to say that the Crow Nation has already endorsed former President Donald Trump. And there are a lot of Indigenous voters in Oklahoma, and also I would say some probably in Alaska, who are very supportive of former President Donald Trump.